Good afternoon. This is Lee Rose with the Financial Brand. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar from LemonadeLXP and the Financial Brand, how financial institutions can upskill remote employees. Before we get started, we'd like to let everyone know that the recording of this webinar will be available shortly after the webinar has concluded. If you have a question, please just use that questions panel on the dashboard and we will get to as many as we can. And now it's my pleasure to introduce John Findlay, CEO and founder of LemonadeLXP, and Romeo Meoni, Director of Business Solutions at LemonadeLXP. John, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for joining the webinar today. As Lee explained, we're a learning experience platform and digital adoption platform all baked into one that's built specifically for financial institutions. But what we're going to talk about today is how financial institutions can upskill remote employees. And I thought we'd kick things off with a quick poll just to get a sense of where you guys are at. So we're just going to launch a quick poll question just to get a bit of feedback. I'm not seeing a poll question as of yet.
It's up.
Oh, I can't see it. Are you able to read it, Ron?
Yeah, the question is, how has the transition to distance learning been going for your organization? The classic, better than expected, same as expected, worse than expected, and in tune with 2020, it's a disaster.
And while we wait for answers to come in, we have a little bit of dead air to fill. So I'm going to tell you an interesting fact about Romeo. Back when he was in university, Romeo rode a bicycle from Savannah, Georgia to Birmingham. So kind of an interesting fact about Romeo. May be true or may not.
And the poll results have popped up. Almost half say it's gone better than expected, but 40% say same as expected, and then 14% are either worse than expected or it's a disaster. So people have been doing a bit better than they had thought.
Okay, great. So let's kick things off. First, I want to talk a little bit about remote working, where we were at before the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, about 4.9% of the US workforce worked from home. It's about 8 million people. 31% worked from home occasionally, which was about 52 million folks. But only 27% of companies actually offered remote work, despite the fact that about 80% of employees wanted to work remotely. So there was a great appetite for remote working prior to the pandemic, but it wasn't deemed all that acceptable by most companies. During the pandemic, remote working shot up to about 110 million people, which is a 13x increase, so pretty significant. And organizations have found that productivity has actually gone up, and they list reasons like more time working because of no commutes, less distractions, less meetings. So it's actually been opposite of what a lot of people thought, that productivity would suffer, but it actually hasn't. And interestingly, in a poll, 35% of employees said they don't miss the office at all. So there's an appetite, continues to be an appetite for remote working. So as we emerge from the pandemic, about 60% of employees hope to continue working from home, and 35% said they would actually change jobs in order to continue working from home, and 30% said they'd take a pay cut in order to continue working from home. So that appetite is pretty strong. And there are a lot of benefits to organizations of having remote workforce. So the average organization will save about $22,000 a year per employee. And those savings are calculated in increased productivity, lower real estate costs, so not having to have the big offices that house folks, reduced absenteeism. Absenteeism actually has been down considerably through the pandemic. People don't feel the need to call in sick when they're already at home, and lower turnover. So less people switching jobs because they are allowed to work from home, and therefore the work experience is improving. So big savings for corporations, but then also for employees. They'll save about $6,000 to $8,000 a year in travel, in parking, and food. But I think the more important savings is time. if you take their combined commute time, they'll save about 22 work days a year in travel time. And I think that's a pretty massive savings for employees. So some pretty big benefits for both the organization and employees. But the benefits come with some challenges. As we first hit the pandemic, our company had to move to remote. And the first challenges we had to overcome were technology and equipment, making sure everybody was set up at home and could actually work effectively. And then figuring out how to make sure that we were productive as a workforce, and enabling collaboration. So implementing a bunch of tools that allow people to collaborate from remote locations. So those were kind of the early stage stuff. But as we move into a more long-term remote working situation, I think it's things like morale and culture and training, which we're going to talk about a little bit more today, that are the bigger challenges. And I think that there needs to be a lot of consideration put into those three things. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to do so with training. But right now we have another poll question. So I'll see if we can get that up. And Ram, I'll ask you to read it when it appears.
Absolutely. So this question is, what's been the most challenging aspect of training remote staff? And the options are tracking results, filling information gaps, keeping engagement levels high, or providing a diverse array of information and styles of information.
So while everybody answers that, I'm going to give another interesting Romeo fact. In university, Romeo was a world debating champion. Again, might be true, might not, but an interesting fact about Romeo. How are
the answers that pop up? It seems like far and away the winner is keeping engagement levels high, which makes sense.
Yeah, sure does. That is definitely one of the bigger challenges. So what we see in talking to clients is the challenges of training remote staff is, first of all, a lot of learning experiences have traditionally been kind of static. And so for remote staff, static learning experiences aren't all that engaging. And they typically cause a bit of a staff aversion to training. We hear that all the time when we interview employees at the organizations we work with, that they don't really love training, and it's largely driven by the static experiences. So if the experience isn't great and staff have an aversion, then driving participation and keeping engagement high is going to be a big challenge. And so I think those are the things that we need to be thinking about as organizations as we try to figure out ways to effectively train remote staff. So let's talk a little bit about some of the key attributes of effective remote training. So I think for a remote staff, self-paced is really important. Through the pandemic, what we've seen is that the line between your personal life and your work life is blurred. And so people are working at strange hours at times. Some people are working in the wee hours of the morning, others working a little bit in the evening. And so I think self-paced is really important. If you have scheduled stuff that people have to attend, you're probably not going to get the same level of engagement and participation as if you have sort of accessible 24/7 training that people can take when they want. I think distributed practice is a really important element. The idea of being able to repeat training whenever you want to, or as many times as you need to, and doing it on a regular basis. That distributed practice is really important. I don't know how many of you watched the documentary, The Last Dance, about the Chicago Bulls, but what struck me about that was how often Michael Jordan was the first guy in the gym and the last guy to leave, shooting the ball over and over and over again. And it's that repetition and doing it every day that really drives mastery. And so I think our remote training, distributed practice, is a really key element. Deliver within the flow of work is another big one. I mean, think about it from a remote employee's perspective. You're no longer sitting in an office where you can just lean over to your colleague and ask how to do something. So when you end up with a challenge, something you don't know how to solve, being able to access training within the flow of work is going to be really important moving forward. Engaging and interactive, I mean, it goes without saying, you're competing against a different set of distractions at home, kids, TVs, fridges, pets, and so forth. So I think it's got to be highly engaging to make sure we keep people's attention. I think the social and collaborative aspect is really important as well. One of the only complaints that the surveys are showing about at-home workers is sort of feeling a little bit isolated. And so I think if our training can involve social and collaborative elements, it's going to help make it a little bit more compelling. The next one, fast authoring. Throughout the pandemic, lots of policies and procedures have changed. New regulations coming into play and so forth, new programs being rolled out by financial institutions. So you need to be able to roll out training very quickly. And so authoring has to be very fast and distribution has to be fast. And the last thing is trackable. I mean, you've got remote folks. You can't sort of count how many people showed up to the in-person training. We have to have in-depth tracking that gives us not only participation and engagement, but efficacy, retention, and impact on the real world business measures. So I think those are the really key attributes of a remote training program. So we'll talk about some of the options. So the first one, your learning management system. And I think some of the challenges that the learning management system presents is, first of all, a lot of them are on-prem. So if you got remote workers and they're having to VPN in and you have multiple VPN connections, first of all, it's expensive. Second of all, it'll be a slow experience. So I just don't think that's the best solution. Now, not all LMSs are on-prem, but a lot of them are. The next one is the complaint we hear from employees, the static learning experience. Often the LMS training is pretty static. And so what you see is low participation, you see low engagement, and high employee apathy. And so I think traditional learning management systems are not well suited for upskilling remote staff. I think we've got to look to other solutions. Another option is live video conferencing, and certainly I think it has a place. I think the ability to broadcast to multiple people at once and get some FaceTime and in-person conversation is good, but inherently that experience is still passive, and so learners are prone to distraction, especially when you're at home and you're on your computer. You can certainly be multitasking. When you're multitasking, you're not going to absorb much of what's being presented. So I think ultimately it's probably not the most effective solution for a remote staff. And then the last thing is, there's certainly some limited tracking capabilities. You can see who attended, but you're not really going to get much in terms of retention, comprehension, and impact. So video conferencing, I think, has a place, but I don't think it can be a staple. Online courses are another option, the kind that you buy sort of canned solutions from companies like Udemy or Lynda and stuff like that. Those can be great. And I think they have a place as well, but again, they're kind of passive, usually mostly videos, PowerPoints, and some exercises. So I think they're good, but they're not going to drive the type of repetition you need. People typically take that course once and they're done. And I don't think that's necessarily going to drive the best learning outcomes, and the retention rate's going to be a little bit lower. And then, of course, the tracking, again, is kind of limited. You're just going to have completions. But I think probably the biggest issue is, through the pandemic, so many different programs and policies, as I mentioned earlier, you need custom solutions. You need the ability to roll out training that talks about the new policies on how to work remotely, or protocols for being in branch, and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of different things. The world is changing fast, and so we need custom training and not just sort of canned stuff. And then the last thing about the online courses is they're expensive because you're paying per user, and per user, for one course, it can be a couple of $100. So if you take that and multiply it by an entire workforce, it can get pretty expensive. So what we've found good solutions with is taking a game-based approach, and there's some reasons for that. First of all, by sort of issuing a challenge and making it fun, you'll see participation rates are considerably higher. The other thing is that it's a very active learning experience because you're presenting challenges to the learner, and the learner actually has to provide input, and they get feedback based on that input. So it creates a very interactive experience that's a little bit more lean forward than watching a video or listening to a presentation. Game-based learning is also inherently a micro-learning experience. The games will be short and quick, and they give feedback. And when you don't do well, you're prompted to try again and improve your score. And that drives the high reps and the distributed practice you need to drive better learning outcomes, which ultimately results in better ROI. And the data on this stuff is really showing strong results and strong impact for organizations. So I think game-based learning is, I think, probably the most effective approach that you can take for engaging and training a remote staff. But I want to talk a little bit about gamification versus game-based learning, because there's a lot of hype and what I would call nonsense about gamification out there. So first of all, talk about gamification. It's the process of adding games or game-like elements to something like training or a task to encourage participation. So you don't change the learning experience itself, you just tack game elements onto it. Where game-based learning takes the training experience and morphs it into a game so that people learn through play. And that's a really important distinction. And I'll highlight a couple of examples here. So here's an example of a learning system that has some game elements. You see that it's got, points and badges and progress meters. And so those points and badges will motivate people to take a little bit of training. But the challenge is they don't really have any context. It's just what are the points for? What are the badges for? What are they relevant? Where's their relevance? And then the next thing is when you go to the learning experience, it's still long form content that's static. So while people might read an additional PDF or two to earn a point, because the points have no context and because the learning experience is still pretty passive and not all that engaging, whatever bump in participation and engagement that you see will be short-lived. Another sort of gamification tactic is this solution, which you engage in training content, be it video-based or long-form content or whatever, and when you achieve sufficiently high engagement rates, you get to play unrelated casual games as a reward. So two issues there. I don't think too many organizations want their employees playing casual games that aren't related to learning at all. But also, the efficacy of this is questionable because anybody can go online to any one of hundreds of sites that have thousands of super high quality casual games to play. They don't need to endure some not very engaging training to get to some mediocre casual games. So I don't think this is the right solution. I think the right solution is to morph the experience into a game so that it's super engaging and so that people learn through play. Now, I've one more poll question that I wanted to ask before I hand things over to Romeo. So Ron, could you read that again, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So the last question is, which department is struggling the most to adapt to distance learning? The options are call center, retail, sales, commercial, or other.
So the last interesting fact I'll give you about Romeo, and at the end we'll see which one was true. In 1996, Romeo went to the National Track and Field Championships for pole vault. He's been a busy guy, this Romeo, very accomplished.
Yeah, and I actually struggle to think of a single accomplishment I can outline of yours, John, as much as I've struggled and thought, well, hiring me actually, it's pretty heroic now that I think about it. That's certainly up there. This is kind of a mix in this poll answer from call center and retail seem to be the biggest one, but a good fifth of other. So love to follow up after and see what those divisions are.
Okay, so I'm going to make Romeo the presenter now, and he's going to show you a bit of game-based learning in action.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do is just show some of the things in practice that John was talking about. So this is LemonadeLXP. This is the main screen that you see when you come into our training experience. We modeled this off of the most addictive mobile games. So certainly stuff that I'm a junkie for, and I know that statistically most of you guys are as well. But the way the game works is you earn currency by doing well in training, and then you buy boosters that improve your game experience and can help you rise up the leaderboard. And each one of those boosters does something slightly different. So there's a strategy element involved into which ones you purchase. And what's great about that is it keeps people coming back every day to see how much currency they've earned and really see how much closer they can get to the next piece. And because this is all customizable, I think it's great to create actually some sort of workplace culture, which is something that's missing, I think, in a lot of remote training, because it tends to be your kind of classic LMS that doesn't really have the unique personality that I think a lot of banks have or financial institutions have. But of course, the only way to succeed is actually through training. And we've developed a system that really is user directed. So you get content specific to your role, but you can kind of approach it at your own pace. And the game nudges and directs you to consume content that you haven't already. So I'm going to jump into just one course. You can see I'm 50% complete. It shows me the pieces I haven't done, the pieces I still need to do to be able to get that 100% for a course. We've got a bunch of different methods for delivering information, and this is where that game-based learning piece that John talked about comes into play. So this one, for example, this is just one of the many we've got, is one that transforms long-form content into a playable experience. So rather than just reading a PDF, or as I used to do when I was a civil servant, just click that you read the PDF, which I'm sure a lot of your employees are also doing. But what you've got to do is find the mistakes in this piece of content, and to be able to get through it, you've got to actually correct them in context. So what this does is really ensure that people actually know this information cold, that they're not just consuming it passively, but really kind of actively absorbing that content as they go through. And of course, when you're done, it connects back to the main experience. So you can see that you've gained clients, which are going to gain you currency, which will help me get those boosters. You can see I'm nowhere close to level 6, but working my way up there. And one thing that I personally found is hard with remote working is losing the social collaborative elements of your training. So what we've done is underneath each of the steps, you have a comment board where you can talk about each piece of it, and kind of learn where there are challenges, where there are successes. In this case, somebody's saying that the presenter could be more handsome, which I consider a subjective comment personally. But you can also rate the step with stars, so that course authors can just really quickly see how people are responding to that content. We've also got stuff like demos, which I think are really useful for gaining the confidence that you need to be able to go through a product or service and really recommend it to a customer. Because I think this is often the last mile of product training that is frequently missed. You can answer questions about a product all day, but until you really go through the process of actually doing an action that we're trying to get a customer to do, you're not going to really figure out, ultimately how the product works and feel comfortable enough with it to be able to really recommend it. So it guides you, but ultimately you've still got to go through the process yourself of really depositing a check and going through all the pieces of it. And I think when you've gone through this, and certainly our stats show that when you do this multiple times, you actually are significantly likely, more than twice as likely, to actually recommend that product in a real life scenario. So we've kind of added some extras where you earn bonus clients from performing this task, so that you're aware of how successful it is and how much it improves the bank when you go through it. One last round that I wanted to highlight, because I think this is part of training that really is tougher when remote, is that kind of emotional intelligence training that you get from conversations. Because I think this is a big part of, a large part of your financial institution is dealing directly with customers, and having a facsimile of a customer there with real pieces of information that you can share with them is a valuable way of getting this information through. We've got a cast of characters that come with the platform, but you can also add your own up to your bank's liking and special occasions. And really, it helps your employees get the conversational hooks they need to be able to really master those types of conversations and perform all the activities that we really are looking for staff to perform. Couple little features that I think are useful for the social collaborative learners. You can build teams throughout your organization, build up those conversations, and really get people chatting with each other and learning more about where they're succeeding, where they're struggling. And of course, for the competitive crowds, think your salespeople. We've got stuff like person to person, but also team versus team competitions. You can see how you stack up, how your unit, division, region stands up against others, and we found this to be really motivational for people, especially trying not to be at the bottom of a leaderboard. We've also got, of course, I think in this era with remote training, you really need to have as much data as possible to be able to measure your training, figure out ROI of the platform, but also just know where you need to improve. And that's one thing I think this platform really excels at, is it really captures all user data. We know when people are accessing the platform, what piece of media brought them to it, how long they spend a day, but most importantly, we know how much they've improved based on engagement with the platform. So what our platform does is establish your baseline knowledge, and then it measures you against that. So it really shows improvement over time. You can also look from a content level and figure out where your knowledge gaps are, or you can zoom in on an individual learner and see if maybe offline training is required, and you can even incorporate offline training directly into your modules. We also have, because we realized this technology would also be useful for customers, we've ported part of it, the demo section, to be public facing for our financial institutions as well, so that you can actually run through these products as a customer, but in a much more targeted and less gamified way. So that's the song and dance for how the platform works. But really quickly, I wanted to go over just some best practices, kind of summarize both what John's talked about and how it blends in with our platform. So first, I think having a cloud-based program over on-premises is much more important now than it ever has been, because people are using different devices. They're at their house, they're at their cottage. They need to be able to access it as long as they have an internet connection. You want a central narrative to tie together the experience, make it feel relevant and valuable for your staff, and ultimately more engaging, so that rather than just flicking through a dead-eyed LMS, there's actually something fun to bring them back every day. And also, rather than the kind of 90s view of gamification where you slap badges on, we think it's important to transform the actual content itself into a game. And just tying off one thing I said at the end of the demo, I think a blended approach really is best when you're considering remote training. You want something that combines both the game-based fun digital stuff that we show here, but a good platform also incorporates spots and areas where you'd want to have one-on-one conversations or practice or shadow a customer call. And it's that kind of blended approach that I think ultimately is going to have the highest level of engagement. Really quickly, some stats in our platform. The vast majority of people in our user base participate voluntarily, so they're eager to come to it and go to it without any requirement. It increases knowledge by 25%, and almost 9 in 10 people, or over 9 in 10 people, prefer other types of training and want more of their training in the format of this platform. So that's kind of an overview of everything, but I'd love to shoot it back to Lee to give us some questions that I know have probably been popping up during this webinar.
Thank you, Romeo. Yes, we do have a few questions, so we'll move right along to those. The first one that came up, do you have a version of this for customers?
So yeah, I can tackle that one. So the learning experience side is exclusively for employees, but on the customer side is a digital adoption platform that externalizes those product walkthroughs and demos onto a branded searchable WCAG compliant hub that is typically used by our FI clients to support frontline workers, but also to allow customers to self-help and support themselves. And then also their marketing departments use it, email out a link to a walkthrough so that they can show customers how easy it is to complete a certain transaction within their online banking or mobile. So yeah, there is customer facing, but it's in the form of a digital adoption platform.
Great, thank you, John. We have 2 more questions and 2 more minutes, so we'll go ahead and try to squeeze these in. How long does it take to get changes approved?
I presume what that question means is how long does it take us to make changes to the platform? But Lemonade has all its own authoring tools baked in, so you can make changes on your own without us. You don't actually need to call us to change anything. So, if you've authored a bunch of courseware or you've authored some product walkthroughs and simulations, you can actually go and change those without us. We do offer authoring service, and we're happy to do that for you, and we can turn things around pretty quickly. But a lot of our customers handle their own authoring, and so they don't even need us for changes.
Perfect, thank you. And our last question, we have a younger workforce and want to make sure staff engage frequently with our content. Do you have any tips?
Ram, you're the younger of us, so I'm going to let you tackle this one.
Yeah, at the fresh age of 31, I suppose I am the more youthful between us. But though it seems to be effective on everyone except 65-year-old men and up, though I think anything remotely fun doesn't appeal to that particular age category. What we found is that young people really respond to both the micro learning, but also the gamified narrative. So when you've got a big, younger or more inexperienced workforce, it's a great way of getting small, crucial pieces of information to them in a way that they really will retain and remember. So we found it's particularly effective with those kind of workforces.
Great, that'll be our last question. So we want to thank you on behalf of the financial brand for joining us. And John, I am going to pass it back to you for closing remarks.
Great. Ron, maybe you could put up the next slide just so they have contact information in case they have any follow-up questions. Thank you. Well, thanks very much to everybody for joining, and Lee, thanks for hosting. I want to clear up some confusion about Romeo. I mentioned a few things, that he had ridden his bike from Savannah to Birmingham, and that he had was a national debate champ, and that he was also a pole vaulting champion. Turns out the only one that was true was he was a debate champion. So that's your tidbit on Romeo. Turning his experience into a little bit of a game. But thank you very much for taking the time. I hope this was good use of your time and that you got some valuable insight out of it. And as Romeo put up, you've got my email. If you've got any questions about the platform or about taking a game-based approach, we're happy to provide any information and insight we can. So thank you very much, and hope you all have a good day.